back to Settlement Nation podcast. I am your host, Courtney Barber, and our guest for today is trial lawyer extraordinaire Thomas Shaw from the offices of Thomas E. Shaw out of Dallas, Texas. Thomas has been practicing law for over 38 years and has done everything from business litigation to personal injury. And this quote, Tom, I found on your website, I think really sums you up well. Tom is not just smart and creative, he is also aggressive and tenacious. My experience is that he enjoys, if not relishes, being an active and zealous advocate for his clients. So speaking of being a fierce advocate, Tom agreed to come on the show today, and he's very busy. So this is a big deal for us to speak about his recent $206 million verdict, which I can't wait to break down and hear more about. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on your show.
I'm going to start today, Tom, with the same question that I asked Keith Mitnick, who I know you've worked with before on his episode. I don't think anyone in your position has had an easy ride to success, but other than hard work, which is obvious, what has been the recipe for getting where you are today?
Well, one of the things that I think is very important is working with people who can make you better, and working with people that are fun to work with. And I've had the pleasure of working with some really outstanding people who taught me what the specialties are in their success. Jacob Norman, Keith Mitnick, Steve Sussman, Frank Branson. They're all people that lawyers out there should get to know, because they're excellent in their craft, and just people that other lawyers should be aware of. The latter two from Texas, and not necessarily local lawyers, but with Sussman and Branson, I did work with them on local cases a long time ago when I was a whippersnapper.
Now, speaking of when you're a whippersnapper, which I do love that word, I know that you graduated from the University of Michigan. Then you took a gap year, which is what we call in Australia, and you did hitchhike around New Zealand and Australia. What was that like?
It was back then. It was late '80, early '81, and New Zealand was a combination of, in my mind, Scotland, Norway, Ireland, and Switzerland. Beautiful scenery, just lovely people. You could hitchhike anywhere in the country. And what I did was I worked on a station, being what they call there a roustabout, which is doing anything the owner asks you to do. I learned to ride a trail bike, not quite a motorcycle, but a trail bike, and learned to shoot a gun, and just learned a lot of things that my dad, who was a farmer, knew a little bit about, and I knew nothing about since I was a city boy. But then I left New Zealand after about 3 months, and I'd met some people while I was hitchhiking who had stations in South Australia, in the Barossa Valley, or just beyond the Barossa Valley, which is a very famous wine area for those folks that are interested in that. And so I got to go to their station and saw a completely different environment than the station that I worked at in New Zealand, because New Zealand's just lush and green and beautiful. And the station where I went in South Australia was not that way. It was more what we would associate with the outback. Although it's not officially the outback, it was very arid and dry, and fires were always a worry. Mm-hmm. But it allowed me time to make sure that I was committed to law school. And I think if anyone can, it's really something to do to assure that whether you're paying for it or someone else is paying for it, that you're doing what you need to do when you're in law school or medical school or whatever kind of school you're in.
And I think that's very important to, as you said, have those experiences. So then when you're ready to go to law school, you can buckle down and soak up all that knowledge. But
Indeed.
last thing about your trip to Australia, what did you pick up with your time there? Was there any customs or a way of life that you found really fascinating that you brought back to the US?
Yeah, in Australia, they have a joy of life that we don't always appreciate here in the United States. The Australians that I met, and then I subsequently went back in '82 to go to school in Melbourne at a place called Monash University, and took a semester there in law. And the Australians have an amazing way of loving life, and then on kind of a similar um, kind of thought process. Their view of the law is very, very different from ours. They're not, they treat it as a profession. We treat it as a business.
Right.
And the Australian lawyers that I clerked over there for a number of different firms, and they all made that point, which I found interesting, that we are professionals, we're not businessmen. And unfortunately, today we have to be businessmen because we have people that we're responsible for.
Mm.
But one of the things I found interesting in Australia is what they call articled clerks, who are what we call associates or summer associates, are paid so little, or they were, I should say, back then. I don't know if that's still the same. I can't imagine it is, but most of them had to live at home. But
Oh, no.
the other interesting thing about the law practice is in Australia, it's an undergraduate pursuit, whereas
Right.
with us, it's a graduate pursuit, and therefore the students are a little older here than they were in Australia. And I found that fascinating. But the advantage of having spent the time in Australia is I've been lucky enough to get cases that allow me to continue my interest in Australia, and still talk to some of the lawyers there that I clerked with. So that and that kind of segues into one of the things that I would tell young lawyers is keep up your friendships.
Right.
And because I still have 3 people over there that I communicate with on an annual basis. We just touch base and check in with one another, and that's just a blast. And when they come to the United States, they'll try to stop by, or if I ever get back to Australia, I'll try to see them.
That's great. And on that point, speaking about sort of helping younger lawyers, I read that you did used to work for a large law firm, after your time back in the States, and then you transitioned to working for yourself. For our listeners out there, there's a lot of people in that position where maybe they're working for a large firm, they've got that itch to start their own practice. What advice would you give for lawyers who want to take that path?
That's a really good question, and I think it's kind of a timeless question. The recommendation that I would give for immediate action would be to go to work for either the district attorney's office or the public defender's office, and take as many if you're going to be a trial lawyer, which most of your listeners, I'm sure, are trial lawyers, that you get as much experience getting in front of a jury that you can, even if you lose. Because, it used to be that, you'd say anyone who's never lost a case hasn't tried very many cases. And, it's something that getting in front of the jury and getting comfortable is so important. And and being genuine to who you are is when you're in front of the jury. The other thing is, as I said before, find someone that, like Jacob or Keith or Nick Rowley or Frank or whoever, that will perhaps take you under their wing and allow you to watch what they do. I remember before I worked with Mr. Sussman, I got to see him in a case against a partner that I worked under, where he represented Xerox. My partner or my boss represented Xerox, and he represented somebody who'd worked for Xerox and had an idea that Xerox claimed was stolen. And watching him in action in federal court was fascinating, and I knew I wanted to find out how to work with him someday, and I was able to do that.
That's great advice. And I think, as you said, getting your trials in is very important for people, and finding a place where you have the opportunity to do that, because if you want to be a trial lawyer, you have to have some experience. So I love that advice, and I hope everyone listening who was in that position maybe takes that on board. So we're going to transition now into a little bit of your trial history. Is there a case that you think sort of took you to the next level as an attorney, or that was memorable, that sticks out for you?
Yeah, there are two of them. One of them was a criminal case, and the other was a case that involved an Australian like yourself who was working on an oil rig in a place called Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia and just east of Indonesia. I think it's east. But it's up there in Asia, and this guy died on an oil rig at the top of a mountain. And the issue, when I got the case from the Australian lawyer that I'd worked with in when I was in Australia, was, how did this guy die, and why is someone responsible? And it was very difficult interviewing witnesses, because it's almost like suing the police department. You have code blue. And in this case, it was, I want to work for oil companies. And if I want to work for oil companies, I'm not going to cooperate with the lawyer who's suing them. And the other issue for me was, because I was a fairly young lawyer at that point, finding someone to work with, like the people that I named. But in this case, in Texas at that point in time, for those listeners who were practicing in Texas in the 90s, before the law changed, if a corporation was doing business in Texas but hadn't designated a registered agent, they were liable to be sued in any county in Texas. And in that situation, I looked around and found what I thought was the most favorable county in Texas to sue. And it was Morris County, which those that have been around a while in Texas know what I'm talking about. And I was able to work with the Nix law firm. And we had great success in that case, basically because we were able to file it in Morris County. And then we found out why he died, and it was the type of situation that's great in when you're a plaintiff, because it just gets worse. The more you dig, the worse it gets. It's like fine wine; it gets better with age.
Right.
And the other case that was interesting to me is back in the 90s. In Texas, the young lawyers who had trial experience were appointed to represent criminal defendants. And so I was lucky enough to be appointed to represent a criminal defendant who had allegedly robbed a check cashing place. And this was just when President Clinton at the time had federalized any crime that involved a gun or involved an institution involved in interstate commerce. So I tried a week-long case for this young man and got whipped pretty badly, but kept the jury out a while. And I think it was probably on one issue. But it really allowed me to think about what it would be like to be a criminal lawyer. And I wasn't very good at it. But
Right.
fortunately, I hired somebody to sit next to me to make sure that I didn't make any mistakes. And the young man that I represented was convicted, but I gave him a good run. That's for sure.
And that's, all you can do. And as you said, you find your way. I've heard similar stories about people who've tried criminal cases and then they just said, I just don't think this is for me, and ended up in the civil world. But I want to talk about another case. This is your recent case that you received this mega verdict. And it's also a very multifaceted case dating all the way back to 2014. And for all the listeners, a Dallas jury awarded the Cruz family, who Tom represented, $206 million in damages from a woman named Brenda Lazaro. Some quick background before we get into it. So Jonathan Cruz died on February 2nd, 2014 from a single gunshot wound to the chest. His girlfriend at the time, Lazaro, reported in a 911 call that he had shot himself. However, the story goes, from what I've read, that the family always found that to be quite suspicious, that, he would be responsible for his own death. So, Tom, going all the way back, how did you first get involved in this case?
It's again, it kind of blends with what we've been talking about before. The Jonathan's father was an opponent of mine in a case that I worked on. John Cruz, the father, represented Carol Shelby, who is, I think everyone knows from the movie, was basically the person who developed the Ford Mustang. And I represented 6 investors in a partnership that Carol Shelby had with someone who was restoring old 67 Ford Mustangs. And we had a unique theory of liability. And John, the lawyer representing John Cruz, the lawyer representing Carol Shelby, had just, taken down all the other investors. And our theory was that they had represented to these folks that there was a partnership with Shelby, and that induced all these 6 investors that I represented to invest, $200,000 in this entity. Well, we were able to convince John and his clients that we had a valid case, and we were the only ones that were able to prevail in that particular situation. And John Cruz and I kept up over the years after that, and just as friends. And at one point in time, he asked to come to my office and talk to me about a matter. And I thought, great. So he came to my office and told me the story about his son. And I hadn't read that in the paper, and I'm usually quite good about knowing those kind of things. And he asked if I would consider representing his family. And I didn't think that I would be able to do that, because I didn't know what I could do. Because the girl who they thought at the time had murdered their son had no insurance, had no assets or anything else. And what they wanted was for her to take responsibility for their son's death.
Right.
And she was unwilling to do so. And so what I recommended that they do is hire a private investigator. They did, and they gathered a bunch of evidence as a result of hiring that particular private investigator. They came back to me a couple of months later, and they asked me to file suit, which I did, just before 2-year limitation period in Texas. So in 2016, we filed suit. As it happens, we got in the same court that John and I had gotten into in
Wow.
the Carol Shelby case. And the judge was really actually quite happy that we had gotten together as on our team. And she said, well, that's the way the law should work, is
Right.
opponents should continue, if they see themselves on the same side, they should relish that. And I did. And John's become probably one of my closer friends because of that. Anyway, we filed the suit, and so many things happened in the interim. I took depositions. I think we took about 12 depositions. I did it for free because I thought it was just the right thing to do. They had, broken their backs spending money to try to investigate their son's death, and John even left the practice of law and went to and basically followed the calling to become a religious leader in a church he founded. And so we got the case ready for trial, I think 6 times. Each time there was a different reason, and no knock in the court. There were just cases ahead of us. And then COVID, which lasted a while, cases weren't being tried then. So finally the judge said, we are going to trial in September. We went to trial in September. She gave us a great trial. We were fortunate enough to get a very large verdict. As you noted, $206 million. And that one of the fun things in that, it's hard to say something in a wrongful death case is fun, but getting to know the clients better, learning their life, and that was something I learned from Nick Rowley and Jacob about really kind of going to dinner at your client's house, right, and getting to know them. And but the funny thing about that is, if you let them down, it's even more devastating,
right?
And yes. So it's. But I highly recommend that, and Keith Mitnick's another that does that and recommends that in connection with injury lawsuits or death lawsuits. And it was just so gratifying being able to help these people. But on the other hand, there was a lot of pressure to come through, and because the mother was just devastated. It just, they say there's nothing worse than burying a child. And I just couldn't imagine that, having a child myself. The other fun thing about that is, it's part of my professional development and professional education, is I was able to retain probably one of the best witness gurus, Joshua Carton. And he just was wonderful, working my clients through the psychology of testifying in front of a jury, and how to work that, and trying to be genuine in front of a jury without sounding, pathetic or something other than being genuine. And I highly recommend Joshua Carton, in using Joshua in connection with preparing witnesses for either trial or deposition. He's excellent.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I hope everyone's listening to that part. Tom, what was the original number that you had for the jury?
It's funny. The way I do it is I try to devote part of my closing argument to kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And then it's hard. You trial lawyers out there that do this, it's hard deciding, when you stop that and when you go to the jury charge and say, okay, this is what you're being given, and these are the answers that I'd like to recommend. Last couple of trials, I've been bad about leaving myself enough time, and that's something that your listeners probably can relate to. And just be sure and give yourself enough time to be able to go through the charge. And in this case, because we were asking for what are called human, I think David Ball calls it human damages, the real damages, there wasn't any true evidence of a number that we could talk about. So I recommended a number that added up to around $95 million. And I'd thought about doing something even larger than the 95, but I thought, I don't know that I've showed that, that the case is worthy of that. And I worried about that, but I wrote in the numbers quickly, and, I saw one juror writing down. And by the way, that's how in the past I've determined from how many jurors are writing down my numbers whether or not I'm going to be successful. And in that case, I only saw one person writing the numbers down, so I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble. And it just I really worried about that, and I closed. And I used a closing that I'd seen done by a DA in San Diego during the David Westerfield trial where he murdered Danielle Van Dam. And I'd always wanted to use that closing. And I was able to use it here. And it was chilling, very chilling. And it was good. And we closed and we went out in the hall, and the first question that the jury sent out written questions, and the first question the jury asked was, where was the gun found? And the reason that was a significant thing is that Brenda Lazaro had said that Jonathan Cruz was standing up next to the bed when he pulled out the gun, and she couldn't make up her mind where he shot himself, but and he shot himself in the flank, and not in a place where you would think a male or somebody really wants to kill themselves would shoot themselves.
Right.
It wasn't in the heart. It was, about 45 degrees around your body from the heart. And what I did was I had the replica gun, and it was kind of an OJ moment where I said, in order for this to succeed, you've got to not only get your arm around there, but you've got to hold it steady, because the tattoo on the body from the muzzle of the gun was very distinct, and therefore the burn was it didn't move a whole lot. So I showed him that, and the jury asked, well, where was the gun found? And if he was standing up, obviously the gun is going to fall onto the floor. Nope, it was on the bed. So they knew our story was more consistent, which was he was sleeping. She surprised him. He got up, went into the defensive stand, and she shot him. So we were pretty comfortable with that question being asked. And then the next question was a happier question for my clients. Can you give us the numbers that Mr. Shaw proposed during his final argument? And the judge said, well, and, those of us who have, had this happen when, there's a question sent out, the judge said, well, we all know that there's no evidence of the number. So we're just going to have to tell the jury. They're going to have to, think back as to what they think the number should be and whether or not, they're the exact same as Mr. Shaw proposed. They'll have to go from their own recollection. And we were fortunate enough that the jury remembered or wanted to make sure that the Cruzes were shown that their son's life had value, and they awarded, or they wrote in a total of $206 million for the damages. And I had said that that they write in a number that told the Cruzes that their son's life had value. And that was the argument before I kind of did Jonathan's voice and telling him that if he were in the courtroom, what he would be saying as to who killed him. And that's, the clients were thrilled because finally someone said in public that Brenda Lazaro murdered their son. And that was a very dramatic moment for them. There was a lot of press there. Axios, I think, was there, and 2020 was videotaping the trial. So it was something that it was a career gratifying trial.
And when that was announced, how did you feel at that moment when they came back and announced the number? Was there shock? Was there tears? How did the family feel? What was that moment like for you?
Well, it was interesting because hearing the knock and the bailiff went back there, and the bailiff brought back the verdict form, and he brought it up to the judge, and the judge showed no emotion. She went through it. I think it was about a 15-page verdict form. And she says, I think you all need to look at this. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. So she hands it to both of us, and we look at it, and I'm quickly looking at the numbers, and I'm thinking, holy cow, this is like $100 million verdict. And my son, who tried the case with me, said, no, Dad, it's even more than that. So I walked back. We gave the thing to the judge. I walked back and I said, you're not going to believe what she's about to read. And I didn't tell him the number. I just said, sit down. And so my clients were worried that perhaps, because I didn't want to take away from them the beauty of what the jury was about to tell them.
Right.
And so the judge brought them back in, asked the jury if this is their verdict, and then read the verdict to us. And then the defendant polled the jury to make sure that, because we got punitive damages, and in Texas, it's got to be unanimous.
Right.
And each of the jurors firmly stated, this is our verdict. And probably the most gratifying thing for the client was, at first we thought the jury had left without talking to the clients. They were waiting by the elevator for me to talk to them. And I didn't know that. And the reporter said, oh, Mr. Shaw, they want to talk to you. And I thought, wow. So I approached them, and what they wanted to know from me was, why is this not being prosecuted? And why aren't the police still actively investigating this case? And I thought, wow, they got it. And it's just what, people like Jacob and Keith and Nick, juries get it. And one of the many things I've learned from those three lawyers is, and also Joe Freed in Atlanta, is don't repeat things. And they get it the first time. And in Vore Dyer, I said, I will try, we're going to try to get through a multi-million-dollar case in 3 days. And I'm going to move as fast as I can and as expeditiously, and I will try not to duplicate evidence. And they even said something about that in, when my private investigators called them after the verdict, that we were good about not repeating things. And that's a very valuable lesson that I learned from those lawyers, and would highly recommend with each of the lawyers listening to your podcast that they keep that in mind, that just trust the jury that they're going to get it. One of the 12 or one of the 6 is going to have heard that piece of evidence. So don't hammer it in. You don't need to.
That's great advice. This is the stuff that people listen to Settlement Nation for, Tom. And that story is just so sort of, it's gratifying and heartbreaking. I actually read a quote from Pam Cruz from a Dallas publication, from a reporter, and she had said, "That's all that I wanted. The jury saw what happened and they saw his value. There is no more words after a verdict like that."
I couldn't agree with her more. And
yeah,
it was, I tried the case for her, and John was so appreciative that this was about a mother's love for her son.
mm-hmm.
And as much as John loved his son, he knew that this broke his wife's heart, and he knew that in order to have closure, that at least partial closure, this did a really good job for them of giving them closure. Now we're hoping that the Dallas District Attorney's Office will consider doing what's right here, and at least presenting it to the grand jury and seeing what happens.
And the last question on this topic, do you have a maybe not a routine, but and something that you do following a trial like this? Like, do you have a practice that night or feeling, or do you have anything that you do maybe to celebrate or to think it over that usually happens after these big cases, or is it business as normal the next day?
Unfortunately, it's business as normal, but because it was on a Friday, I had planned to get away and kind of decompress up in New York City for a weekend, and I was able to do that in this case. But one thing I would recommend, and one of the lawyers that I talked about earlier, he and I have a case at the end of the month, and Jacob Norman and I are trying a case in McKinney at the end of the month. And one of the things that I found very valuable is staying at a hotel during that time that's like right next to the courthouse, so that you don't worry about driving to the courthouse at, in the morning, or driving home at night, that you get to go back to the hotel. And we had a war room in the Cruz case, and I think we'll probably do something similar in the case that Jacob and I are working on in McKinney, Texas. And I found that very valuable, and something that I'll try to do as often as I can. I did it earlier in the year in Fort Worth, in a real estate fraud, not a real estate fraud. It's a real estate case involving some flooding, and we had a very positive result there. And that's kind of my routine now, is staying at a hotel near the courthouse. And I recommend that to lawyers that that are in that situation. But I also realize that oftentimes driving home or driving to the courthouse allows you to clear your head. And that's something that is very valuable too. And I realize that's something that those who have, young children at home or marriages that are new or even old, that you clear your head and you give the requisite amount of attention to people at home. And it was good for me because it's difficult for me to turn off the brain when I'm in trial, and I am envious of those who can do that, and I just don't happen to be one of them.
I think that's very important, setting yourself up for success. And if, as you said, if you're in the war room, you can focus, you get rid of all those other distractions, of which could be outside influences, traffic, those things. You want to make sure that you're clear and you're focused on the task at hand. I love that advice. We have two questions left, Tom. First of all, you work with your son, James. You spoke about him before in this big case that you just had. What's it like working with your son and working with family in the business?
Oh, gosh. It makes it all worthwhile because watching him work with me was so gratifying, and I'm so appreciative of the lawyers that trained him. I didn't train him. One of my oldest friends in Dallas, Gregory Shamoon, who is just an outstanding trial lawyer here in Dallas, trained him and taught him many valuable things that he brought to my practice, so that I learned from him probably as often as he learns from me. But it's just having someone that has your back all the time. And it's so gratifying to be able to work with him. I got to say, there's nothing negative about him being in the office other than I can't swear as much.
Right. Yeah, there's eyes there. So you've got to be the good parent, which, right. Listen, if we can all swear less and do those things less, I think that's actually better, especially coming from Australians who curse a little bit too much. Coming to the end, what is something that you know now that you wish you knew 10 to 15 years ago as a trial attorney?
The importance of a mentor and the importance of trying cases with people you really like. And a third thing is choosing your clients carefully. And I've been lucky enough in my practice that I can choose my clients as opposed to them choosing me.
Right.
And I'm humbled by that people even consider me. But I'm appreciative of the fact that I can't take every case, and oftentimes I'm not the right lawyer for someone. And so I recognize that, and I hope that the potential client does too.
I love that. And last bit, do you have any closing words of wisdom or advice that you could share? You've been doing this for a long time, and obviously you're very good at it. So if there's anything that you could share to the other lawyers out there, what would it be?
It would be to make sure that you come to work every day with a mind that you're going to learn something from the experiences you have every day, and to love what you do. Because coming to the office and not liking what you're doing is a recipe for failure and a recipe for disappointment. And I try to come to the office every day relishing what's about to happen and looking forward to thinking of things that can help my cases move along.
I love that. Well, Tom, this has been such a pleasure. For listeners out there who maybe want to reach out to you, speak with you, get help or co-counsel a case, how do they reach out to you and how can they contact you?
They can call us on the phone, which is 214-221-7429, or reach out to us via email, which is LOTESATTYS.com. And I'd be delighted to talk to anyone.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. I mean, I'll be seeing you in a couple days anyway, which is great.
Yes.
Actually, one day.
Yes,
one day
I know, it's hard
from
to believe.
now.
Yes.
I know. I'll be seeing you tomorrow.
Veterans Day.
Oh my gosh, it's going to be great. So for all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning into Settlement Nation. Appreciate your support. We love being #1 in trial lawyer podcasts, and this does go out to thousands of you. So if you like hearing from Tom, you want to know more, reach out to him. He is a lovely person, and we'll be back next week with more content on Settlement Nation. Bye for now.